Namaskar. Vidya Mandira is a temple of learning. We wish you all a very warm good afternoon. In keeping with the sustained and continuous tradition of upholding the lofty ideas that Vidya Mandira stands for, the Departments of Political Science and Philosophy, Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandira, Belur Math, Howrah, have jointly organized today's International Symposium. The theme of today's symposium is Exploring Challenges to Morality in Modern Democracies, a Politico-Philosophical Perspective. We are fortunate to have with us very illustrious resource persons, Professor Shobhanlal Dattagupta, formerly Surendranath Banerjee Professor of Political Science, University of Calcutta, Professor Dimitris Vardolakis, Associate Professor of Philosophy, School of Humanities and Communication Arts, Western Sydney University, Australia, and Professor Pralayankar Bhattacharya, Head, Department of Philosophy, University of Calcutta. Our academic engagement today begins on an auspicious note by Vedic chanting by faculty of the Departments of Political Science and Philosophy of Vidya Mandira. Dr. Shondipon Sen from the Department of Political Science, Dr. Shontu Kandar and Dr. Shobhik Datta from the Department of Philosophy. Please, sirs.
Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Bhadram Karnebhih Srinuyama Devaah Bhadram Pashyemakshaviryajatraah Sthirairangaistuštuvagum sastanubhih Vyashema Devahitam Yadayuh Swasti na Indro Vriddhashravah Swasti na Pusha Vishwavedah Swasti Nastarksho Arishtanemih Swasti no Brihaspati'r Dadatu. Om Shanti 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 Madhuvataricayate Madhuksharanti Sindhavah Madhvirna Santoshadih Madhunaktamutoshasi Madhumatparthivagum Rajah Madhudyaurastu Nafpita Madhumanno Vanaspatir Madhumagum Astu Suryah Madhvirgavo Bhavantu Nah. Om Madhu Om Madhu Om Madhu Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
This rendition was in the ancient Indian language Sanskrit, and English translation has been appended in the folder, sirs. May I request our Principal Maharaj, Swami Mahapragyanandaji, to present the welcome address. Maharaj, please.
Shri Ramakrishna. A very good afternoon to the faculty members, research scholars who have come over here to attend this program from different colleges, universities and research institute. Our faculty members, our respective resource persons, distinguished speakers on dais, and dear students. Well, at the outset, I would like to extend a very cordial welcome to our one of the distinguished panelists of this session, Professor Dimitris Vardolakis, Associate Professor of Philosophy, School of Humanities and Communication Arts, Western Sydney University. So Professor Dimitris has come all the way from Australia to this place, and today morning we are having a short discussion with him, and I told him that we all are very happy, all the members of our Vidya Mandir Parivar are very happy to have you. And we say always that whenever somebody comes and joins us, he becomes, this family, this Parivar has no separation. So, welcome Professor Dimitris. Today we have with us Professor, another panelist, Professor Prolankar Bhattacharya, Associate Professor and Head, Department of Philosophy, Calcutta University. And we have with us panel chair, Professor Shobhanlal Dattagupta, who was formerly Surendranath Banerjee Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Calcutta. So, Professor Bhattacharya and Professor Dattagupta, so they have long connection, association with our Vidya Mandira Parivar. So I welcome all of them, and especially I welcome today with us Professor Pinaki Bhattacharya sir. So he was one of the senior most persons here with us, and I welcome all the faculty members of departments of political science, including the head of the department, Indrashish Babu, and philosophy head of the department, Professor Shantu Kandar. And I'm very happy to see the faculty members, research scholars from different institutes, colleges and universities. Most welcome, cordial welcome, hearty welcome to this Vidya Mandira, the temple of learning, as envisioned by the epoch-making thinker Swami Vivekananda. And students also, some undergrad, postgrad students who have enrolled their names, I welcome them also. And I'm very happy to see the students from both the departments and faculty members from other departments, also Department of English and Department of History, other departments, they have also come here, so I welcome them. And there will be panel discussion. So I think after, as I always say, that after this panel discussion, I hope this time also there will be the scope of interaction. So with this, once again I welcome everybody, and I pray earnestly to Thakur Ma and Swamiji for a wonderful success of this seminar.
Maharaj, it indeed is always a privilege to invite Sir, Professor Shobhanlal Dattagupta. Sir is a mentor, a teacher for generations across disciplines, at least in West Bengal. It's very heartening to see one of my college friends here who has spent most of his working life abroad, but since he was in the front bench in Calcutta University listening to Sir's renditions, I requested him, and Bhaskar is here, and it's really a reunion of sorts. Besides, Sir's quality lies, amongst so many other things, in something which is very rare. In fact, the quality of disaggregating the most complex of theories, thoughts, and academic issues in the simplest of manners. This makes him so endearing, in fact, indispensable to generations of teachers, scholars, and students across disciplines, as I said. Sir, Professor Shobhanlal Dattagupta had his education, and it's my pride that I also studied in the same institution, as did Professor Prolankar Bhattacharya here, Presidency College, Calcutta, and then in Calcutta University. He retired from Calcutta University in 2008 as Surendranath Banerjee Professor of Political Science. His major works include The Comintern and the Destiny of Communism in India, 1919-1943, 2006 publication. It has been translated in Malayalam and German. Some of his recently published works include Marxism in Dark Times, Select Essays for the New Century, which was published in 2012. The Socialist Vision and the Silenced Voices of Democracy, Part 1, Rosa Luxemburg, 2015, Part 2, Nikolai Bukharin, 2019. He is currently co-chairman of the International Rosa Luxemburg Society in Berlin, Germany. Vidya welcome sir with a token of gratitude and appreciation. May I request Binoy Murmu from the Department of Political Science, EG3. Binoy, please. True to our own tradition, স্যারকে বরণ করে নেওয়া হচ্ছে উত্তরে দিয়ে। As Maharaj said, that since we became autonomous, at least my department has been associated with Sir, who is a member of the Board of Studies, and we are indeed fortunate to have had his ideas and his mentorship all through. This is a privilege really for us, a very proud moment. Professor Dimitris Vardoulakis, he was the inaugural chair of philosophy of Western Sydney University, Australia. He is currently the vice president of the Council of the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences and has served as chair of the Australasian Society for Continental Philosophy. A PhD from Monash University, he is graduated from the University of Glasgow and has been awarded with very prestigious awards which have very global standings. He has been a regular visiting professorship at Pantheon University in Essence since 2012, which is ongoing. His regulated visiting professorship at the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society, Columbia University between 2014 and 2018. Then again, a visiting scholar at the Institute of the Public Life of Arts and Ideas, McGill University, Montreal. He had the Humboldt Fellowship, Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship in 27, undertaken at the Peter Sondy Institute, Freie University in Berlin, Germany. By way of introducing some of his works, Freedom from the Free Will on Kafka's Laughter in 2016, Spinoza, the Epicurean, Authority and Utility in Materialism 2020, The Ruse of Technique, Heidegger's Magical Materialism 2024, and standing in 2025, we've had Sir's latest publication, The Agnostic Condition, Materialism and Democracy 2025. He is the co-editor of the book series Incitements, published from the Edinburgh University Press, and the Journal of Philosophy, Politics and Critique. It is really a pleasure, a privilege to welcome Sir. May I request Gaurav Banerjee to please do the honors by extending a token of appreciation from Vidya Mandir to Sir. Please, sir. Thank you, sir. Dr. Prolankar Bhattacharya is presently the head of the Department of Philosophy, University of Calcutta. He is associated as guest faculty here in our PG section of the Department of Philosophy. He is a member of the Ethics Committee of Fortis Hospital. His areas of research and interest are social and political philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, continental philosophy, philosophy of Kant, Greek philosophy, feminist ethics, post-modernity, modern Indian thinkers, especially Tagore, Swamiji, and Gandhi. He has published a number of articles in very prestigious journals. He is the co-editor of at least 2 books. His recent articles include his thoughts on Kant, Marx, Heidegger, Sartre, and he talks about justice, he talks about Gandhi, Tagore, environmental ethics, and so on. We now would request Pritam Khan to extend on behalf of Vidya Mandira a token of appreciation to our very own PV sir.
Please come. Please come inside.
বসে পড়ো, চেয়ার থেকে বসে পড়ো।
সামনে চলে আয়, চেয়ার ফাঁকা আছে, বাবা চলে আয়। Please come.
Teachers were engaged outside, so they are now free there. They're coming in, joining us. We will now move over to the academic session. The thematic introduction will be followed by the presentations of our distinguished speakers, Professor Dimitris Forodolakis and Professor Pralanga Bhattacharya. The session will be chaired by Professor Shobhanlal Dattagupta. This would be followed by a question and answer session. Certificates of participation and refreshments will await us outside this hall after the end of this academic session. May I request Dr. Shondipan Sen, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Vidya Mandir, to introduce the theme of today's symposium. Please.
Namaskar. Let me extend my heartiest greetings and respect to all the resource persons we have in today's seminar, and my respectful pranams to Professor Pinaki Prasad Bhattacharya, my esteemed teacher who is present here in the audience, and my greetings to all my faculty friends and friends from other institutes, colleges and universities, and my love and affection to my dear students. Let me now briefly explain why we have chosen the topic of today's symposium, that is exploring challenges to morality in modern democracies, a politico-philosophical perspective. Democracy essentially means rule by the people. It also implies many other things, including rule of law, rule for the good of the ruled, accountability of the rulers to the ruled, absence of any discriminatory treatment on the ruled, of the ruled based on imposed qualities, and most importantly, securing equal rights and freedom for the ruled. Since its inception in ancient Greece, democracy has evolved to a great extent and has now become a dynamic, versatile, and at the same time a very contested concept and process. In the ancient Greek city-states, democracy was not considered as a preferred form of rule by many. Plato discarded it. Aristotle at times equated with mobocracy. The Romans, although favored republicanism, were still skeptical about democracy. Democratic socio-political values were almost obscured in the Middle Ages in Europe. It was only in the 18th and 19th centuries European thinkers like Locke and Rousseau endorsed the idea of democracy on the backdrop of epoch-making events like the Glorious Revolution, the American War of Independence, and the French Revolution. However, reconciling the spirit of direct democracy with the increasing demands of universal adult franchise in large, multi-ethnic and complex nation-states seemed a daunting task for the liberal thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Although Mill emphasized on the importance of democracy as a catalyst for self-development, he was still skeptic about the efficacy of people's representatives in running the affairs of the state. In the 20th century, two different forms of democratic rule emerged in different parts of the world. First, the socialist democracies like the USSR and the PRC, and second, the electoral democracies in decolonized nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. After the end of the Cold War and the decline of the socialist bloc in the 1990s, the Western liberal idea of democracy was projected as the sole preferable mode of governance across the world. There was much euphoria about this third wave of expansion of democracy. So much so that in mid-1990s, a US president proposed to export democracy to the rest of the world. Ironically, within decades, we saw an incumbent US president inciting a violent mob to attack the US Congress in Capitol Hill in a desperate attempt to thwart the ratification of his defeat in the presidential election. Even that was not enough. The same person was re-elected with a more robust mandate by the US electorate in 2024, in spite of knowing about his hawkish stances on many sensitive and crucial issues like gender justice, social security, immigration policy, climate change, global trade, international security, and many more. Unfortunately, this trend is not restricted to the US only. Around the same time, the right-wing parties in Europe demanded for adopting stringent immigration and trade laws. Brexit was one of the fallouts of these attempts. Colin Crouch, in his work Post-Democracy 2004, argued that in late 1990s and early 21st century, the Western world was passing through a phase which was neither democracy nor non-democracy. Identifying this as post-democracy, he describes it as a condition when powerful minority interests have become far more active than the mass of ordinary people in making the political system work for them, where political elites have learned to manage and manipulate popular demands, where people have to be persuaded to vote by top-down publicity campaigns. The spread of identity politics, sudden upsurge in transnational terrorism, and consequently of Islamophobia, and the global economic recession, all these contributed to the rise of conservative and populist political forces across the world since the dawn of the 21st century. In the first 2.5 decades of the 21st century, the right-wing nationalist and populist forces managed to score impressive electoral gains in countries like Turkey, the Philippines, Venezuela, Australia, Israel, and India. Russia and China steadily merged towards despotic rules of autocratic leaders. The hopes for a democratic transition of the Arab world, ignited by the Arab Spring, quickly evaporated as most of the Arab nations rapidly fell under the control of Islamic extremists. The Stockholm-based International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, in its reports titled The Global State of Democracy 2017, described the situation as following. Governments, parliaments, and political parties are increasingly viewed by their electorates as unable to cope with complex policy problems. Many see a crisis of legitimacy in democratic institutions and processes, coupled with a creeping erosion in public trust, which exposes democracies as fragile and vulnerable. Even mature democratic systems can corrode if they are not nurtured and protected. There is evidence of a growing discontent between politicians and the electorate. transnational challenges related to inequality, migration, and globalization are complex problems that challenge democratic institutions to respond effectively to public concerns, causing a decline in trust and legitimacy in democratic governance. The report further states, it is thus no coincidence that populist and extremist political parties and leaders are successfully exploiting their electorate's insecurities. Exclusionary rhetoric occupies more space in public discourse than before and can influence the outcome of elections. If the recent rise of populism with authoritarian tendencies is unopposed, it could undermine democracy from within using democratic tools. In an attempt to theorize these political trends in one of his recent works titled I Am the People, Reflections on Popular Sovereignty Today, published in 2020, Professor Partho Chatterjee identifies them as crises of the hegemony of liberal democracy evolving out of complex structural processes of tactical contraction of the integral state during the phase of neoliberal governmentality in the West and the emergence of competitive populism in post-colonial democracies like India. He observes, the possibility afforded to subaltern populations to anoint a sovereign of their choice who would fight the enemy and give them justice without being bound by the opaque procedures of law and bureaucracy is a powerful motivation that is likely to sway those people who feel disempowered by their invisible oligarchic rules. And he says again, the fallouts of these processes, in his estimation, are features such as centralization of power in the hands of an authoritarian leader, the repression of the opposition, the showering of benefits to a core base of supporters, and the undermining of institutional norms. He further states that soon many of these features of Indian populism that are presently observed now are likely to appear in the liberal democracies of the West as well. Interesting, in spite of all these shortcomings, democracy is still being considered as a magic wand to validate any exercise of power. Thus, Robert A. Dahl, in his Democracy and Its Critics, fervently hoped, even though the exacting requirements of democracy could not be fully met and many of the theoretical and practical problems of the democratic process would not be completely solved, the vision of people governing themselves as political equals and possessing all the resources and institutions necessary to do so would remain a compelling guide in the search for a society in which people may live together in peace, respect each other's intrinsic equality, and jointly seek the best possible life. The one aspect of democracy that makes it crucial for validating any exercise of power is the consent of the people being affected by such exercise. And this particular aspect of democracy, more than any other, makes it quite problematic in terms of moral considerations. In non-democratic regimes, the people have no say over the selection of the rulers or over their decisions. Thus, in spite of being persecuted in many ways, the people in non-democratic regimes do not bear the moral burdens of the misconducts of the rulers. The non-participation in non-democratic regimes renders the people a protective shield, as it were, with which they may distance themselves from the immoral acts of the rulers and their consequences. But in democracies, the people cannot evade the moral bearings of the rulers, who are supposed to act merely as their representatives. Democracies are expected to make men free, and freedom of conscience is considered as the highest form of freedom. However, if democracies cannot facilitate and secure freedom of conscience for its citizens, rather they somehow tend to suppress it, then the basic objective of having a democracy would be defeated. Thus, the questions arise: does democracy make its citizen morally vulnerable compared to a non-democratic regime? If so, what is the nature of that vulnerability, and how, if at all, would we overcome such vulnerabilities? On the backdrop of these politically and also philosophically critical considerations, exploring challenges to morality in modern democracies seems a quite compelling endeavor. We look forward with great expectations to enrich ourselves in our search for answers to these questions from the deliberations of the esteemed and erudite speakers in today's symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sen, for setting the tenor of today's academic discussions. It is a request now to Professor Shubhananda Gupta to please take over as panel chair and moderator of this international symposium. Please, sir.
Any further time? The speakers have already been introduced by the organizers. So I invite Professor Dimitris Varzoulakis to make his presentation.
Was it PowerPoint? Actually, it's impossible to turn off.
Oh yes, sure.
Just this one because I'll cough otherwise. Oh, amazing. Thank you. 45. So, is a, do I need to speak at the microphone or you can hear?
No, between the microphones, microphones are there.
It's a great honor to be here at Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandira. It's so you can hear me with this, right?
Yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
yes. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much for hosting me. It's a great honor to share the stage with such illustrious colleagues. Thank you for all the introduction. It's a real thrill to be in such a wonderful place like Calcutta. I've never been here before, and it's been a really amazing experience to be in this vibrant and exciting and wonderful city and in this wonderful campus. I couldn't believe all the flowers when I arrived. It's really beautiful. Professor Sen kind of did the democracy part. I'll do more of the morality part of the title. So we'll complement each other. You can't hear me?
It's okay.
It's okay.
This is working now.
Okay, okay. All right. So can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. All right. So I'll do more of the morality part. But what I'm going to present is part of a project that covers 4 books, a tetralogy, which I've been working on for over 20 years. So I just want to give you 2 kind of points about this overall project that will explain what I'm doing, and I will return to these 2. I won't explain them in detail here, but I'll return to them at the end of the paper if I haven't gone over time too much. The first point, the 4 books are really an attempt to rethink materialism. What does materialism mean? And the 4 books are structured on the same problem about the connection between materialism or monism. For me, the 2 terms are synonymous. Monism or materialism and ethics. It's the same problem that arises over and over again in the history of thought. This is the problem that I refer to in my work as the problematic of action. And it goes something like this. If everything that exists is of one quality, and I think you'll hear echoes here of Indian philosophy as well, if there is no, to put it differently, if there is no separation between immanence and transcendence, which which is a characteristic of Judeo-Christian metaphysics, then how can we say that certain actions are good and certain actions are bad, if everything is part of the same existence, of the same being? Whether I act correctly or incorrectly is part of the same existence. This is a problem that we find in antiquity. Cicero, for instance, in his book De Fato on fate, that is the topic of the book, but we find in modernity. For instance, existentialism is very much exercised by that problem. You probably remember Albert Camus' The Stranger. You have someone walking down the beach, holding a knife. He sees another person, a Muslim. He's like, well, if I kill him or if I don't kill him, it doesn't make a difference. We can hear the same thing in popular culture as well. Whether I vote or I do not vote, doesn't make a difference. So unless you have something that is given to you from the outside, how can you say, like some kind of rule or something like that, some kind of authority that tells you what is right and wrong? How can a materialist philosophy say they will have good and bad? And in the 4 books that I'm writing, well, 3 are written and the 4th one I'm writing at the moment, I argue that there's 2 and only 2 strategies or 2 kinds of answers to the problematic of action. One, I trace back to Stoicism, Stoic philosophy. And the answer here is that we can say that certain actions are good and bad because before we enact anything, before we act, and before the action has any effects, with our mind, with our rationality, we can determine that there are certain things that are good and bad. So for instance, Seneca says we can determine with our rationality that it's good to give benefits to our friends. And then, after we do that, we can decide what course of action to take to administer the benefits correctly. So that's the Stoic answer. I also refer to it as the ineffectual for various reasons. I'm just throwing the term there because I might use it later. And then the second answer is the phronetic tradition, which in a sense is the opposite of the Stoic. Here, the answer to the problematic of action says that we can distinguish actions, we can say certain actions are good and bad, only by examining their effects. There's nothing that precedes and grounds action. It is only through their effects that we can discover whether actions are good and bad. Right? So it is these 2 traditions that occupy a lot of my work, and I examine them in a lot of my work. And I will present these 2 traditions here as a contrast between 4 modern ethics in secular modernity, which I will identify as belonging to the Stoic tradition. And then I will present certain aspects of the phronetic tradition to argue that it is a viable alternative. Now why, and that's the sort of second point, why is the phronetic tradition not very well known today? Why is it that the phronetic tradition, we have lost sight of it? Why is it that we have lost sight of it? It seems to me that for various reasons, one key characteristic of phronesis has become universally kind of rejected, and that's instrumentality. To say that we determine a certain action as being good and bad, depending on its effects, we're looking at what the instrumental calculation is for the action to come about. So someone has to have certain means and ends that they try to achieve, and then we can compare whether they achieve their ends with the effects that their actions produce to make a judgment about their actions. So phronesis is an instrumental kind of thinking. Why is it that nowadays, in political philosophy, in ethics, instrumentality is universally rejected? Maybe the notion of instrumentality that is put forward in ethical and political theories is not the phronetic notion of instrumentality. That's what I will suggest today. And the phronesis has been forgotten, and here my paper and my project is to kind of revive phronesis. This is, in summary, 4 books, about 500,000 words. Okay, so very schematic. I just want to give you the sort of landscape. Okay, so in modernity, we'll have 4 main strands of secular ethics, namely ethical theories or moral theories that start by wanting to reject the Judeo-Christian metaphysics distinction between transcendence and immanence. These are deontology, consequentialism, virtue ethics, and ethics of the art of the event, associated with continental philosophy primarily. What characterizes all these ethics is the idea that there is something that precedes and grounds action. The Stoic mood, as I described it. All these ethics do it differently, and there are huge variations within each of these 4 strands, but that is the common denominator. Something precedes and grounds action. Further, all these ethics understand instrumentality as something technical, something measurable, something which has specific ends, which is the opposite of what phronesis is. Phronesis understands the end of action as the good, which can never be measured, it can never come about fully. And I will talk about more about this distinction in due course. So I would like to sort of contrast in this paper these 4 ethics of modernity to a 5th ethics, the ethics of phronesis. I'll just go over the 4 modern theories or modern strands of ethics very quickly. Deontology is characterized by identifying universal rules or values, the dignity of the human or something like that, as becoming the basis of moral theory. And deontology is really the foundation of what has come to be called liberal political theory. That's really important. Rawls, Habermas, they come out of a Kantian deontological ethics. Now, this idea that something has to precede action and to be unconcerned with its effects because it grounds the effects goes to quite extremes. So, for instance, there is the famous exchange between Constant and Kant. After Kant wrote his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, where he talks about the categorical imperative as preceding and grounding action, Constant wrote a public letter to him, and he goes, well, imagine that you're harboring a friend at home, and someone who wants to murder your friend comes and knocks on your door and says, is your friend here? I want to kill him. Would you still follow your own universal principle that you have to be truthful? Would you still not lie to someone who wants to come and kill your friend? And Kant's response is, no, I would not lie. Why? Truthfulness is a duty that must be regarded as the basis of all duties, to be grounded on contract, that is, on a social contract. Without truthfulness as a universal principle that precedes any action, we cannot have a political community. The law of which is made uncertain and useless if even the least exception to it is admitted. Okay? So, at no point does deontological morality considers the effects of action. It starts by grounding morality on a universal principle or law. And he expresses that in the famous to act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your own will a universal law. The universal law can never be instantiated. It can never be known fully, but we always have to act as if as we know the universal law. This is the very famous sentence from the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. So we see here then in deontology something precedes and grounds action, the Stoic move. Utilitarianism. All actions, says John Stuart Mill, are for the sake of some end. When we see this utilitarian position, we go, well, here nothing grounds and precedes action. Here is much closer to the phonetic tradition. But that is deceptive, because John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians were very concerned about having a theory about how, the ethical is related to how we'll calculate the ends of our actions. Because then the problem is, how can we avoid self-interest? How can we avoid someone who might be bad? He might want to make instrumental calculations and manipulate us, or something like that. And John Stuart Mill's response is, we can avoid that. We can avoid the problem of the self-interested or lying or manipulative agent, as though instinctively. Similar to the Kantian as if, but with one difference. What does that as though instinctively mean? He says, every human being is nurtured to act in particular ways. We're educated and cultured to act in particular ways. And the more educated, the more cultured we are, we will act always for the common good, for the greatest happiness of all, okay? Which is the criterion that structures the end of utilitarian ethics. And this leads to a radical individualism. He says, oh, there is really very few individuals of higher faculties, and it's for these individuals that we need to look at them in order to say who makes the right utilitarian calculations. I'm moving a little bit fast because of time. And then there is the discourse of virtue ethics that develops, especially after the Second World War, which wants to position itself against deontology and against utilitarianism, firstly because there's no universal principles, and secondly against utilitarianism because who is a higher individual that can make the correct judgments, Who is that, yeah? So the discourse of virtue ethics kind of opposes all that and finds itself in phronesis, as Alistair MacIntyre, one of the major figures in virtue ethics, the keystone of all virtue. Phronesis or prudence, in the Latin root of the term, is the virtue which is manifested in acting, so that one's adherence to other virtues is exemplified in one's action. So here again, we might think, and we do have indeed, a kind of instrumental ethics, because virtues are always, as Aristotle teaches us very explicitly, every action that we perform has a certain end, and virtue tells us whether we've accomplished the ends well or not. That's the sort of Aristotelian position that MacIntyre is following, and phronesis is the primary ethical and political virtue. So, we think here that we might avoid the Stoic route that needs to presuppose something as preceding and grounding action, and yet that is not the case. Because for MacIntyre too, we need to presuppose something. And what is that? We need to presuppose as a community that will have common ends that we agree on. Otherwise, virtue ethics collapses. Unless we have rationally determined that there are common ends that guide our actions and guide how we apply the virtues that we're espousing, it is impossible to have a harmonious community. Why? Because it is really difficult to argue about ends. If you have an end, I don't know, that vegetarianism is an ethical position, and therefore oral action need to be guided by particular eating habits, and someone else has the opposite position that meat eating is healthy or whatever. Well, if you have different ends, irreconcilable ends, there isn't really much middle ground. We can argue about the means of how to achieve a certain position, but if you have irreconcilable ends, there is no middle ground. So for McIntyre, what precedes and grounds any kind of ethical decisions that have effects in real life is a prior agreements that every community needs to make about the ends of that community. Right? So very much like deontology and utilitarianism, we have something that precedes and presupposes action. And ethics of the event and art is the characteristic kind of ethics that we'll find in continental philosophy. And Martin Heidegger is the significant figure who first formalizes that discourse. And my book from last year is all about this topic. So I'll just do a kind of very quick summary. This is significantly, it is this, in the US especially, in England too, there is a distinction between political science and political theory. And political theory tends to be leaning on this discourse as opposed to deontology, utilitarianism, or virtue ethics. So the key characteristic of Heidegger is to say that he returns to the question of being. How can we have a conception of existence that doesn't reduce being, as he puts it, to mere presence, doesn't reduce it to science as a sequence of cause and effects? How can we preserve, he says, something of the mystery of existence? And his answer to that is that we need, well, first, before we go to his answer, he looks at the ethical moral theories that were available at the moment that he was writing. Deontology and utilitarianism, virtue ethics hadn't been conceived yet. And he says, well, both of these theories reduce action to mere presence. Why? Because deontology will need a system of rights and a system of institutions to actualize the categorical imperative, and therefore the sort of abstract principle is always reduced to mere presence. And utilitarianism, because it's always calculative, and any calculation, any instrumentality that is that we employ, kind of reduces being to mere presence. So for this reason, he rejects all prior ethical theories, and he proposes something else. He says, if we think in being properly as non-reducible to Judeo-Christian metaphysics, the distinction between immanence and transcendence. If we think in being properly without reducing being to immanence, to mere presence, then that thinking itself is an act. But it is an act of a particular kind of nature. He says an act that has no result and no effect. And it is from this line from the letter on humanism that I translated as the ineffectual. That's where I started talking about the ineffectual, the Stoic position that something precedes and grounds action as the ineffectual. What precedes and grounds action in the Heideggerian and the continental philosophy tradition is something that has no results and no effects and precedes any act. So we see then four positions. All of them say there is something that precedes and grounds action, and they give that something very different determinations. A universal principle. The higher cultured human being that can make the correct calculations, a prior agreement about the ends of a particular community, or some kind of thinking event which is articulated particularly through activities such as art, for Heidegger, poets like Hölderlin or Sophocles kind of embody this thinking with no results and no effects, So, the articulation of that something is very different in these four theories. But all four theories agree there is something that precedes and grounds action. So these are the four ethics of modernity that I want to talk about and to show that all of them, in various ways, adopt the sort of Stoic strategy about how to talk about the good and the bad, if you want to put it that way, when we adopt an ontology that rejects the distinction between immanence and transcendence. Okay, so the fifth ethics, phronesis. So let me go and give you some general characteristics of phronesis, and then I'll go through several quick examples of phronesis. So the key characteristic of phronesis is kind of the opposite of the Stoic tradition or the four ethics that I described. Instead of something that precedes and grounds action, it is the effects of action in themselves that tell us whether a particular action is good or bad. This places an enormous onus, an enormous responsibility on the individual, because it basically tells the individual that your ethical responsibility is to calculate the effects of your action, because the effects of your action that tells us whether you're acting for the good of the community. The end of phronesis, says Aristotle, is the good. And without the good, as we will see in a passage from Antigone shortly, without the good, you cannot have eudaimonia. You cannot have happiness, contentment, the sort of state of well-being that only the wise person can achieve. Right? So the good is discernible in its effects means that the virtue and knowledge and judgment that we call phronesis is an instrumental kind of judgment. This is characterized, I argue, by three key functions. It is situated, it is performative, and it is intersubjective. By situated, I mean that it presupposes an ontology that does not admit of the distinction between immanence and transcendence. It's not a creationist ontology like the ontology of Judeo-Christian metaphysics. And we can see that in various ways. For instance, Aristotle defines the truth of phronesis as the kind of rationality that we bring to bear and the emotions that we bring to bear by considering the given circumstances within which we're called to act. Okay. That's what I mean by the situatedness. There is, when we're called to act, there is nothing outside the given circumstances that informs our judgment. It determines whether our judgments are good or bad. The second aspect is to highlight the performativity of phronesis. The performativity of phronesis does not rely on a sort of linear causality, which would say that we can scientifically determine which actions will be good or bad by placing them within a chain of causes and effects. Because if the end of our actions is the good, well, how can we know what the good is? We can strive for the good, but we can never really attain it. That is a key characteristic of phronesis, and that means that we might be striving for the good, but at the same time, we might make mistakes, who might end up with very wrong judgments. So Phronesis, because of his performativity, because he doesn't have a kind of science to ground it, it's not like utilitarianism that has a calculus based on higher quality, educated, cultured men, because it doesn't have a calculus. It means that his judgments are fallible, okay? And that is a negative aspect of the performativity of Phronesis. But what is the positive aspect of the performativity of Phronesis? If the judgments are fallible, and if the judgments are related to the circumstance we find ourselves in, it means that no action is in and of itself bad. It's also dependent on the circumstances. And this is a liberating thought. If you're submitted to very strict kind of moral codes, to suddenly hear, well, every action is good or bad depending on its effects, that's a kind of liberating idea. Spinoza puts that very well in the preface. This is really the topic of his preface to Book 4 of the Ethics, and put here my favorite quote from this passage. He says, well, music, he says, nothing is in itself good or bad. Take music, for example. It is good for someone who is melancholic. It is bad for someone who is in mourning, and it's indifferent. It has it makes no difference at all to someone who is deaf. So the same action can have different effects. And that's something liberating in the Phronetic tradition. And thirdly, Phronesis is intersubjective. It's not about the individual. It's not judgments that the individual makes only based on themselves. In Greek, in ancient Greek, the individual is the word idios, right? And the word idiot, the Greek word idiot, comes from the same root. Idios in Greek means individual and an idiot. Yeah? In ancient Greek philosophy, the subject is always related to others. So when we're calculating the good for myself doesn't exist. The good that the Phronesis calculates needs to be situated, which means cognizant of its environment, but cognizant of also those who are in that environment. Right? It's an intersubjective kind of judgment. Now, the difficulty with that, the negative aspect of this intersubjectivity of Phronesis, is that we can imagine individuals who can manipulate people and tell them lies and make their lies believable about how they determine the good of the community. Trump is a great example. Trump opens his mouth and lies come up. Like he was saying, I was reading the paper this morning, he was saying, Ukraine started the war against Russia. This is just a factual lie, right? It bears no scrutiny. Everybody knows that Russia invaded Ukraine. It wasn't the other way around. So, but if people who tell lies can manipulate you, and because of the intersubjective nature of Phronesis, they can persuade you and make you do things against the good of the community. Well, that is the major problem of Phronesis. And the Greeks refer to it, or Aristotle and Sophocles and various others, refer to this characteristic of Phronesis as dodinon, which means great, terrible, abject, all these sort of different things. But on the positive side, what this intersubjectivity of Phronesis means as well, right? There's no negative without positive. The positive side, it means that intersubjectivity undercuts absolute power. If the primary ethical virtue, knowledge, and judgment is intersubjective, it means that no one can make judgments without having to consider the others. Machiavelli is really good on that. Machiavelli, who is famous for saying, well, you know, you become a sovereign and you have a bunch of enemies who might threaten you in a few years' time. What's the best thing to do? Go and kill them all in one go. He's immoral, right? Like, don't hold back, you know, just go and get rid of them and then you can lead a happy life. You know, you don't have to worry about it anymore. But at the same time, he says, if you're a sovereign and you do not consider your subjects in the judgments that you make, in every judgment that you make, you might arise hatred towards you from the subjects and resentment from the subjects, and that will be catastrophic for you. So even the sovereign, the absolute sovereign, has to consider the people. Yeah. His judgments, his ethical and political judgments, are not his own to own. So these are the three kind of functions: situated, performative, and intersubjective, that characterize phronesis. Now, this is like the hook to the examples I'm about to give you of phronesis. And to give some more thickness, I just gave you a general description of phronesis, and I want to give you some more thickness. Detienne and Vernon wrote a really significant book called Cunning Intelligence. This is a kind of difficult translation, but let's give it a word. Cunning Intelligence in Greek Culture and Society. And their argument is that if we look at Greek philosophy, Greek literature, Greek culture in general, there is one major characteristic that we find everywhere, namely that sort of instrumental kind of thinking that Greeks were particularly focused on. And they say there is a myriad of terms to refer to different aspects of instrumental thinking. And they take as their key term the term metis, which is one of the words called used for instrumental thinking, but they acknowledge that phronesis is the philosophical term that corresponds to metis. Okay? So for Vernon and Etienne, the sort of virtue and knowledge that are referred to as phronesis, it's not like a side thing that concerns philosophers in the academy or the lyceum or the stoa or the garden or whichever philosophical school you want to attend. It is something that is ensconced in Greek culture long before the establishment of any formal philosophical schools, long before that instrumental thinking that concerns the good takes the name phronesis. And they say that the paradigmatic figure of metis and by implication phronesis is Ulysses from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay, so following their lead here, in another part of my book, I go through the major schools and of philosophy: Aristotle, Plato, Epicurus, and the Stoics, to show what the Stoics say, or what the different schools of philosophy say about phronesis. But what I want to do here is to turn to literature to find some of these functions of phronesis. I can't be comprehensive, I can't cover everything, but I'll give you some examples from literature that talk about the situatedness, the performativity, and the intersubjectivity of phronesis. Okay? Oh, and this is a slide which is not in my my book, but this discussion is not in my book. This arises from a conversation with an Indian friend. I'm very interested. You know, when I say I'm interested in materialism, I open my comments by saying I'm interested in materialism, and by materialism I understand any kind of thinking, any kind of ontology that is not distinguished between immanence and transcendence, which is the kind of ontology that characterizes the monotheistic, the Abrahamic religions Judeo-Christian metaphysics, that kind of thing. Well, what happens if we look at systems of thought outside the monotheistic religions that embrace the distinction between immanence and transcendence? In the monotheistic religions, God is transcendent because God is the creator. God creates something out of nothing, which none of us can do. Create something out of nothing. And because God is transcendent, we can never see God. We can never hear God. What is the whole kind of leitmotif that characterizes Augustine's Confessions? I don't know whether you read Augustine's Confessions. Oh, he constantly complains, God, where are you? Why are you not speaking to me? Why can I not see you? Well, the reason why is because God is transcendent. In cultures, religions, systems of thought, where transcendence doesn't exist, it seems to me that gods can appear. And this is a good example. There's a popular film, The Man Who Sued God. It's an Australian film. There was a natural disaster. The insurance company refused to pay because it was an act of God as a natural disaster. So the protagonist, Billy Connolly, sued God. And in this whole movie, God doesn't appear. And then there is an Indian remake called OMG. It's exactly, they basically take the script and adapt it for India. And here, God appears in the movie. Why? Because God is not transcendent in Indian thought. So what I'm saying here then about the different kinds of ethics that characterize what I call secular modernity, it can be phrased in a different way. We can say, what are the kind of ethics that characterize a kind of ontology that just doesn't know about transcendence? And then that would include non-Western thought as well. And I'd be very, I don't know much about Indian thought or Aboriginal thought in Australia and so on and so forth. I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts about which of the ethical theories I described very quickly you think is more apt in various kind of forms of Indian thinking and so on. Yeah. Anyway, phronesis and eudaimonia, phenomenological approach. This is really important. Am I just 5 minutes? Oh, okay. I thought I had until 22. No. That was my calculation.
No, we started at 9. I think around what time? Started 1:50.
Okay.
1:50.
I'll go quickly. Okay. So phronesis, its end is the good, but the good is not the good in itself. We need to achieve the good of everybody in order for everybody to be happy, and that is the notion of eudaimonia. So the first example comes from Antigone. This is the last line of the play Antigone. Shall I assume that people know the play? Yeah. So this is the last line of Antigone. Πολλό το φρονέρε δαιμονίας πρώτον υπάρχει. Phronesis is undoubtedly the principal function of happiness. The translation is not very good. Without phronesis, you cannot have happiness. You cannot have eudaimonia. Phronesis is the precondition of eudaimonia. The suggestion from the chorus is, Creon has just left the stage. You, Creon, have had a disaster because you do not have enough phronesis. You order your nephew not to be buried, then you order your niece Antigone to be killed, and that's what created all the disasters. And where did Creon fail? He failed to consider the intersubjective nature of phronesis. Right? A few lines earlier, Creon laments that he's like a king. He's a king in an empty palace, and that makes him less than nothing. Less than nothing. Μάλλον ή μηδένα. Less than nothing. Second example, that phronesis is not something that just happens. Phronesis is something that we have to actively pursue. And the example here, most of the examples are with Ulysses. The example here is from the Odyssey, the episode with the Cyclops. You probably remember, they're stuck in the island of the Cyclops, and Polyphemus, one of the Cyclops, is eating the Thacans, and so on. So Ulysses plays a trick on him. He wants to get him drunk, to blind him so they can run and get on the boats and go away. But he knows that when they blind him, he'll wake up and he'll call out for the other Cyclops to help him. So when Polyphemus, the Cyclops, asks him, "What is your name?" he says, "My name is Utis, no one." So he gets the Cyclops blind drunk, and then he actually blinds him, And the Cyclops, Polyphemus, calls out to his fellow Cyclops, "Hey, no one blinded me, no one blinded me." So clearly the other Cyclops think, he's blind drunk, which he was. And, they run to the boats and escape. Okay? So the point here is we can make instrumental calculations, but the instrumental calculations that were made for the greater good, for, Ulysses and his comrades to save their lives, these calculations do not happen by themselves. You have to act, you have to struggle, right? That is the point. Anyway, I was going to refer to Nietzsche here, the Homer's Contest, where he makes a similar point. I'll skip that. The commonality of phronesis. There is this incredible fragment from Heraclitus, fragment 113. Xenon esti passito phronein. And this is usually translated as thinking is common to all, or practical thinking. The phronein, thinking phonetically, Practical thinking is common to all. This fragment has survived in Strauber's anthology, and Straubert was someone who collected wise sayings in an anthology to give them to his son. That was a done thing back then. And why would you collect a saying that says, "Oh, practical thinking is common to all"? Clearly, a 3-year-old child would have already worked that out. Yeah. So it seems to me that a different translation is possible. I won't go into the linguistics here of the Greek, but believe me, that translation is possible. The act of phronesis, to phronei, registers effects on everybody in a community. The act of phronesis registers effects on everybody in a community. So the idea here is not that practical thinking is common to all, but the thinking of the good that characterizes phronesis is not only something that everybody does, but it is something without which a community doesn't exist. Contra Alistair McIntyre, it is not an agreement about the ends that needs to be common. It is the activity of phronesis that needs to be common. Okay, so what is the good though? How can we define this good? Where does the good begin and where does the good end? There's a famous story about Croesus and Solon. Solon was the person who wrote the first democratic constitution. And after he wrote the first democratic constitution, he decided to go for a big trip and leave the Athenians to implement his constitution. He's one of the wise men, 7 or 9, I can't remember now. 7 or 9 wise men of antiquity. Anyway, Croesus puts him up in his palace, and he shows him all the gold, all the diamonds, everything that he has at his disposal, and asks him, "Well, would you say that I have eudaimonia? Would you say that I have happiness?" And Solon says, "Well, I can think of others who might be more happy than you." "Whom?" says Croesus. He says, "Well, I know of these 2 brothers. They were very poor, but they were very pious. And their mother had promised the god to take the god an offering at the temple at the top of the hill. and she had arranged for an ox cart to take her to the temple. But something happened to the ox, and the ox wasn't available. So the two brothers decided to carry the mother on the ox cart all the way up to the top of the hill for the mother to make the offering that she promised to the goddess. And they were incredibly happy. They were eudaimoniac when they accomplished this task. And they were so exhausted that night from the toil to go up the hill of that cart that they died. But they died happy. Eudaimonia, happiness, is impossible πριν τελευσίρεστα καλώς, without having a good end. So phronesis then, the calculations of phronesis do not pertain to a specific good here and there. Have $1 million in your account or whatever. Phronesis, the good of phronesis, pertains to one's living as a whole. Techne and phronesis. Is that okay if I go 5 minutes over time? 5 minutes over time. I'm sorry about that. I miscalculated. So I said that this is a very significant distinction. Okay? And I want to demonstrate because techne and phronesis are both instrumental. Techne meaning technology, craft, and so on and so forth. So Aristotle, in book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is a very significant book, he says that techne and phronesis are the only two practical virtues that include intellection, is usually called in English, but he really means that sort of calculative element, το λογιστικό, the sort of calculation about means and ends. The only two practical virtues that include that element of thought. So a big part of book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics is how to distinguish between the two. And my example here is, you'll probably know the greatest trick that Ulysses pulled was the Trojan horse. He had a wooden horse constructed. He told the Trojans, because the Greeks were laying siege on Troy for 10 years, didn't manage to sack the city. And he told the Trojans, we're giving up, but we're giving you as a kind of, to honor your victory, we're giving you this present, the wooden horse. And in fact, there were warriors hidden in the wooden horse, and at night they opened the gates, the Greeks came in, and that's how they sacked Troy. So everybody knows that Ulysses conceived of the Trojan horse. But who made the Trojan horse? Who made the Trojan horse? Nobody knows that, unless you are a Homer expert. There is one lateral, by mention of someone called Epeius, who made the Trojan horse. That's the only reference that we have in the two epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, about who made the Trojan horse. And if you see here the difference between someone who is frenetic and someone who exercises craft, a craftsman, someone who exercises techne. Okay? Techne is about something that is measurable. Yeah? Did he make the wooden horse that would hold the warriors inside, and that had a hidden gate for them to, a hidden hatch for them to come out? The ends are reached with certainty. If the horse worked, the Trojan horse worked, he was a good carpenter, or whatever you call it. And most significantly, the ends of techne are independent of the producer. Who made your mobile phone? Not only you don't know, you don't care. Because it is not intrinsic to the ends of techne, to the instrumentality of techne, to know who the producer is. The product is independent of the producer. This is a complete opposite. These three characteristics are completely opposite in phronesis. The good is immeasurable. We said it covers the whole of one's life, as we saw in the previous example. Further, the act is coextensive with its performance. Like Ulysses performs a trick, the Trojan horse, that is singular. Nobody performed the same trick again. exactly the same. You know? So there is something kind of very singular to phronesis, which can never disengage the actor with the end product, unlike techno. And this is a really significant distinction for the phonetic tradition. The Siren's got the repression of phonetic instrumentality. The next look, I might skip that. I'm happy to talk about it. This is about the critique of instrumental reason and so on. I'll just go to the last slide and I'll wrap up just to respect the time. Oh, I'll have to skip that too. Okay, I'm skipping two. I'm going to the last one. Oops. Philosophy in ancient Greece was not about building up knowledge only. As Pierre Hadot says, in What is Ancient Philosophy, his argument is that philosophy was a way of living, And I think one of the best descriptions of that comes from Epictetus' discourses. Epictetus, of course, is a Stoic philosopher, right? And one of the discourses is conversations that he has with his students outside the classroom after the end of the school day. So they're informal conversations that one of the attendees recorded. In these informal conversations, one student says, "Oh, you know, and these cynics, you know, aren't they really filthy and terrible? You know, how can you stand them? You know?" He says, "Well, in matter of fact, that is not necessarily the case," he says. So a Stoic talking about another school of philosophy that he's opposed to and defending it. He says, what characterizes the cynics is an extreme asceticism. They will give up things. But asceticism comes from the word ascesis, which means training or disciplining yourself to perform certain actions in a way that will determine how you live your life. So Epictetus recognizes that ascetic element of the Stoics is common also to the cynics. He says, whoever has the right ascesis ultimately looks beautiful, and he brings the example of Diogenes, the first cynic, who may never have had a bath, may have been living in the street, and yet he looked radiant wherever he went. So ascesis, so phronesis, and the wisdom that comes from phronesis, the wisdom that comes from philosophy, is not something that just happens to you one day, you know, through epiphany. There is no road to the Damascus where suddenly, you know, you become enlightened. You have to try for it. You have to work for it. You have to train for it. Yeah? And that is very much part of the ancient phronetic tradition. So, just to conclude, you know, I want to show then that if we start with a secular ontology, an ontology without the distinction between immanence and transcendence, there are four major strands of moral theory that dominate the discourse today: deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and continental ethics, ethics of the art and data. All of them are characterized by one common position, namely that to determine that certain acts are good or bad, we need to have something that precedes and grounds action. The other option that we find in the history of philosophy, the option that characterizes the phonetic tradition, says the complete opposite. It is in the effects of the action itself, which we undertake by exercising our phronesis, by calculating the good as the end of our actions. It is in these effects who can find the good and the bad. This is a counterintuitive proposition for us today. Phronesis seems to have disappeared, or the idea of phronesis have disappeared from the majority of the philosophical vocabulary, and even more significantly, it seems to have disappeared from the way of our everyday thinking. And yet, if we go back to the tradition, not only the philosophical tradition, but the literary tradition, the cultural tradition, we can still find several examples of how phronesis operates. And maybe, if we examine these examples and we have more time to go through them more carefully, maybe we'll be persuaded that phronesis will be a viable alternative to the Stoic tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Varzulakis, for raising some very, very interesting questions. Intellectually, I find it very rewarding, extremely enriching, extremely stimulating, and so thank you very much. And I think a lot of questions will come up in the Q&A session. So I will now invite our second speaker, Professor Pralayankar Bhattacharya, to make his presentation. Actually, the title of his presentation is Understanding Moral Psychology of Living Course with the People, Crisis and Catharsis. Very interesting.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Respected Chairperson, sir, Professor Dr. who is almost like my teacher, although I am not his very student, but I always consider him as my teacher because I have learned so many things from his lectures and writings. So I'm really fortunate that I'm sharing the stage with Professor Dr. Gupta. It is also my proud privilege that I'm sharing the stage with Professor Dimitris Vardoulakis because he is a well-known author and thinker from philosophy. I extend my thankfulness and gratefulness to the Department of Philosophy and Political Science of this esteemed institution. My thankfulness also goes to the Principal Maharaj Authority of this esteemed institution, dear colleagues, friends, respected professors, and my dear students. The title of my lecture, as it has been said, that is The Moral Psychology of We the People, Crisis and Catharsis. Whenever I think of present democracy, actually initially when the theme was introduced, the lecture was mostly on democracy, as when Professor Vardoulakis was giving his lecture, it was mostly about morality, and I will try to conjoin these two, and I will try to remain faithful to this theme of this symposium. Whenever we think of this democracy present now in contemporary world and precisely in Indian context, I am reminded of two statements made by two great thinkers, one from the West and the other from India, ancient India. The Western thinker is none other than, was mentioned also by Professor Dimitris Vardoulakis. He is German thinker Martin Heidegger. He had written a book, what is called Thinking. And the statement he wrote in that book is that the most thought-provoking thing in the thought-provoking time is that we do not think like that. And another great thinker of the ancient India, not ancient India like that, he was from Charvak school. His name was Jayarashi Bhatto, and he said that avicharita ramonia, that is, no thinking is a matter of enjoyment. The less you think, the more you enjoy. So we are presently living in that kind of society where no thinking is a matter of enjoyment. It is true that democracy is a contested concept, and many theories have been developed to define democracy, to illustrate, to elaborate democracy. Many critics, many criticisms given against democracy right from Plato up to this period. And some of the criticisms of Plato still seem to be relevant in the present era. As far as democracy and morality they are concerned, and if we try to explore the moral challenges within democracy, what kind of challenges we really find, and what is that crisis at present, and how to deal with that kind of crisis or those moral challenges. In fact, in 1993, a book was written by John Rawls, who's an American philosopher. The book was published by Columbia University Press, and the name of the book is Political Liberalism. And in that book, Rawls very categorically said that as far as different moral theories are concerned, as Sir, I'm starting just where Sir finished. There are many different moral theories like deontology, like consequentialism, like virtue ethics, like feminist ethics, ethics that is based on emotion, so many things. All these moral theories, views about ethics, morality, all our religious views, all our philosophical views, they are actually the comprehensive views of our life, and they have nothing to do with the political culture of democracy. Democracy would celebrate only two values, that is freedom and equality. But my concern is that democracy is no doubt a setting, a kind of social setting, socio-political setting. And in our democracy, in Indian democracy, most of the students I think from political science, so I would rather refrain myself from using any special technical philosophical terms because of the scholars and students are present here. So when in our constitution it is said that we the people, because I have used this expression in my title, this we the people, if we analyze, we will find that this we is nothing but the relation between I and others. And any relationship, if there any kind of relationship, there is always action, reaction, all kinds of activities are there. So therefore, each I has many others. When I say we, there is only a single I, and the rest others. And in morality, we know that without acknowledging autonomy, there can be no morality. And without morality, we cannot explain meaningfully, authentically, human relationship. If we look at our Indian tradition, the expression has been used, dharma. Dharma is diffuse. It has many, many connotations. But the very two important connotations of dharma are morality, virtue, and on the other hand, one, justice. They are intrinsically connected when the word, the expression dharma is used in Indian tradition in Indian context. Therefore, whenever we think of democracy and its relation with morality, we have to understand or realize what about the basic values that are to be nurtured or fostered within democratic society. Recently, many words have been used regarding this degradation, deterioration of moral values within democracy. Questions have been raised many times. Many books, many articles have been written on this particular issue. For example, a book has been written like Assessing the Quality of Democracy by Larry Diamond, and there is another co-author. And it has been called as the democratic recession. It's a kind of stagnation at this moment, democracy. We criticize, we raise questions, but the stagnation is there, we can never deny that, as far as morality is concerned. The ethical rationale of democracy, if we try to understand that, precisely I'm talking about the liberal democracy, which have derived through the social contract theory tradition, lies in its promise that it will offer a government and institutions. It will offer a government and institutions, social political institutions, that will not hinder or say obstruct individual efforts to realize the good. That is the promise democracy has to keep. An autocracy, aristocracy, if you ask, they will not deny the truth that yes, it is good that the individual should be allowed to realize his or her own good. But the problem is that no such systems like aristocracy or dictatorship or whatever you say, unlike democracy, they never make such a promise that it will never hinder or obstruct individuals to realize his or her own good. Now, the point is that we all know, present here, that promise keeping is always a moral behavior. Everybody knows that. You don't need to be a student of philosophy. That promise keeping is an ethical behavior. Deontologists, consequentialists, virtue ethics, all types of ethics would acknowledge their approaches are different, their interpretations will be different. And that is really democracy. But the question is, foremost, that how does a system can make a promise? How we can resolve? A person can give a promise, can make a promise to others, to another person. Maximum a group of people can resolve something. We see normally before a football match begins or cricket match begins, but how is it possible that a large number of people in a big country like India, largest democracy, that we resolve, all of them resolve at the same time, the same thing? This is to some extent an ontological issue. To some extent this is an ethical issue also. And the relation between an individual identity and the group identity, collective identity is another issue. And this is really a question that what can be the ethical implications of prioritizing we over the I? Let us try to understand if we at all find out any way out or some techniques to deal with this kind of issue. My first section is about democracy and we the people. As I have told that our conception of democracy at present is a kind of liberal democracy. I don't need to explain that before you. And on the basis of social contract theory, right from Kant, Rousseau, Locke, Kant, Rousseau, through different thinkers, Marx, Mill criticized the then democracy. Kant criticized the then democracy. Instead of that, he tried to uphold republicanism, which almost sees eye to eye with the present democratic system. Now, coming to the phrase "we the people" that I have used in my title. Both ontologically and ethically, this seems to me a problem. In fact, whenever we are discussing about democracy, the present democracy precisely, we must keep in mind that democracy is resolutely both individualistic and pluralistic. And democracy is individualistic because it tries to make room for individual rights and freedom, all this. But the problem is about our misconception and misinterpretation of pluralism that we normally try to celebrate in democracy. And I think the question of ethics, the moral challenges come up in connection with our misunderstanding of pluralism, theoretically as well as practically. I will first in this section give at least four aspects, four advantages, or rather 4 keys to avoid this kind of misunderstanding, misconception of pluralism that we find in democracy, or that we normally think that pluralism has to be there in democracy. First, there has been a very interesting article by Bimal Krishna Motilal, and that name of the article is Dharma and Rationality. It's a very fascinating article. The students can go through this article. Bimal Krishna Motilal, in that, it's not about democracy, but it is about dharma and rationality, especially on the Indian context. He has made a fascinating remark in that article. He said that it is the logical aspect that I'm talking about. The demand for rational decision, we are talking about rationality, and democracy always demands social rationality. Even when we talk about phronesis or practical wisdom, there is also a demand for that kind of rationality, reason and all this. Although maybe it's not the Kantian type of reason. So he says that the demand for rational decision is always greater when pluralism is admitted. This argument is that if we acknowledge pluralism, if we admit pluralism, which democracy seems to admit, their rational decision gets wider. The demand for rational decision gets higher. It means from this premise, we can derive the conclusion, if we follow this argument, that is, first of all, conflict is healthy. The point is that conflict is not unhealthy, conflict is healthy. This is why, and this is to some extent even goes against that Hegelian approach that you find in the philosophy of right. That is, in civil society, the conflict will emerge because civil society is the sphere of continuous competition, coercion. So definitely it will lead to kind of finally war, and the state, the authoritative, the moral power of the state has to play an important role to control this kind of conflict. But this kind of approach would definitely acknowledge that conflict is healthy. We must know how to deal with this kind of conflict, how to address this kind of conflict. 2 or more offending principles may be put under the strict logical scrutiny with regard to a particular situation, so as to discover whether one can be allowed to override the other. So, first of all, democracy, if we logically think of democracy, democracy seems to afford, seems to propose incommensurability, and in connection with the diversity of moral goods, there can be different types of conceptions of moral goods as far as democracy is concerned. I will give you only one example regarding this. Take a value or virtue we call, that is non-violence. We know that non-violence, since the ancient period of Indian culture, Indian philosophy, in most of the system, in yoga philosophy, in different systems, in Buddhist philosophy, non-violence has been considered as one of the most important significant virtues. Even Gandhi has acknowledged that also in his different writings. Now, non-violence is virtue as a basic value. We can acknowledge non-violence as a basic virtue. But there can be difference of opinion how to understand the meaning of non-violence as a moral good, as a virtue. And it is possible, the catharsis is that it is possible only in democracy to go through all these kinds of interpretations and finally come to a decision. For example, somebody would explain non-violence as only non-injury. Some other person would explain non-violence as non-killing. Somebody would explain that non-violence is actually non-cruelty. It's not non-killing or non-injury, it's non-cruelty. Somebody would say that absolute non-violence is not possible, so under certain circumstances, violence is also required. So we get all these interpretations as far as non-violence, but each of them would definitely acknowledge that non-violence is one of the basic virtues that we need to practice in our social life. So therefore, whenever we talk about plurality, we must take into account how to distinguish plurality and totality. I will come to this point at the end of my discussion. I leave it here. Secondly, logically and ontologically, if we think, when I say that we, as I said in the beginning of my, starting at the outset of my lecture, this we means I and non-I, the relation between I and non-I, I and others, because there is only one I and all others. In Bengali it is called opor. Whenever I utter the word I, it doesn't imply that there are many I's, but it simply means that I is not self-contained and it is not entirely a separate entity from others. Moreover, individual actions and experiences shape the group identity and the group identity shape the individual identity. This possibility is always there. Therefore, we by nature, if we try to understand the nature of this we of, say for example, this Indian society, democratic society, this we by nature is what I should say polemical community. And this polemical community doesn't mean this plurality, as I was talking about, does not mean that, or rather it means, it implies that there is a continuous, discourse and dialogue and all these things. In Indian tradition, then it was always there, tarko. It was there in the form of tarko. And more important, what the recent thinkers have thought about, that is, say another virtue, another value is tolerance, right? But the question arises in the recent past, or rather when I talk about democratic society, what kind of tolerance? What kind of toleration? Tolerance does not mean that it is a kind of disengaged tolerance. Tolerance means engaged tolerance. Disengaged tolerance, recently Amartya Sen has reflected on this particular point in his book, The Idea of Justice. And when I say that disengaged tolerance, that means you are justified, you are right in your community, in your party, in your group. I am justified in my group, there is no more debate, there is no more discourse. You remain good there, I remain good there, so everybody is fine. That kind of tolerance, that kind of disengaged tolerance, democracy never expects. I mean, this is not a healthy democracy if there is this kind of disengaged tolerance. So, tolerance must be there, but tolerance must emerge out of our engagement with others. Third, my third point is that there is another way of understanding this we, that is I. Sorry, There is another way of understanding this we, and this idea I'm taking from Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist ethics. That is, in Sutta Nipato, Buddha has given this particular argument. The argument goes like that. Despite conflict, there are conflicts. Democracy from the very beginning accepts conflict. Conflict is a part of the political culture of democracy. But despite conflict, there has to be cooperation. This is our normal demand. And the basis of this cooperation is not symmetry, but asymmetry. So since there is plurality, since there is pluralism, if we accept that, then pluralism logically and also practically leads to asymmetry. There cannot be symmetry. And this asymmetry is the basis of cooperation. This is another way of, another argument that could be found in Buddhist ethics, Sutta Nipato. What does this mean? Buddha actually applied this argument initially to explain human responsibility to animals. And Buddha gave an example, the relation between mother and child, the ethical relation. The mother does for the child, and recently feminists, theorists have taken up this issue also. And mother takes care of the child because mother is so powerful that he or she feels responsibility to the child. The argument actually implies that the more powerful you are, the more responsibility you have, and you must extend that to the others who are less powerful. Last argument in this section, that is this we that we are trying to explain in Indian democracy precisely. This we actually can be understood from another perspective, that is the man's unsocial sociability. The continuous conflict, why? Because I'm using this expression from Kant's writings, idea for universal history. So at the same time, I am social and unsocial. This paradox is there. I try to remain unsocial because I try to enjoy my pleasure, my space. But still, I also feel that I need to be social because I need all the other things like appreciation, reward, my education, my health. So all these practical affairs always compel me to remain social. But this continuous struggle between social and unsocial. Sometimes I feel that I need to be social, sometimes I remain as unsocial. And from this conflict, the other things emerge, develop, like art and culture. They develop from this socializing the unsocial aspects of human being. This is a very interesting thing if we really focus on we as far as democracy is concerned. My second section, it is the moral psychology of this crisis. It is true that the present democracy presents completely a different picture that I have tried to give in my first section. If we look at the present democracy, it's a very, by the logic of facts. In this section, whatever I'm going to say, only by the logic of facts that I experience every day in democratic society. In the same democratic society, it is surprising to see, if you closely look at the present democratic society, there is, on the one hand, there is excess of democracy, and on the other hand, there is lack of democracy. Why I have said this? I have said this, that there is a community, you will find, that who have this kind of excess of democracy. And this has become really a burden of democracy. You remember, those who are from political science, students and scholars, that there is a book by Pratap Bhanu Mehta, that is The Burden of Democracy. Now, a group, a section, a community enjoys this excess of democracy. Whatever I say, and whenever I say something, I consider it as my democratic right to say. It becomes opinion. If you look at the channels in the television in the evening, you will find out that so irrational, illogical arguments are being given because they think it is his or her democratic right to express opinion. So anything becomes opinion. Anything you say becomes an opinion, however and to whatever extent it can be logical and irrational, and it lacks any kind of argumentative ability. So the excess of democracy means more freedom, more wealth, more right to say anything. And on the other hand, there we find in the same democracy, there is a lack of democracy. And when the lack of democracy in that zone, you will find that there is a kind of rule worship. And in the excess of democracy, you will find that rules don't matter. Now, this seems to be oversimplified. Let me explain. The state or the system within the democracy, with the consent of the people, has created an atmosphere of disseminating a kind of anomie phenomenon. That means lack of basic standards, basic values. I'm not talking about any particular theory, only basic values are lacking. And it is true, now there is also a kind of debate can be there. For example, if I say, do not lie, do not break your promise, do not steal. They are all ethical judgments, ethical statements, no doubt. Do not do all these things. These are the basic rules, and they seem to be universal because everybody should follow that in a society. But the complexities of our living in a society sometimes demand some unusual principles in an unusual situation. For example, where actually we have to brush aside, set aside the normal standards of universal rules or principles. I give an example from the history. Everybody knows, and this seems to be the irony of history, that Hitler came to power in Germany through democratic process. And now you think that if you were at that time in Germany, you know that lying is wrong. But if you were in Germany at that time, in Nazi Germany, and suppose the Gestapo came to your door looking for the Jews, and 2 or 3 Jews are hiding there in your house, it would surely be right, perhaps, to deny the existence of the Jews' family in your house. And here, lie becomes the truth. There are many examples in our philosophical traditions. In our Ethics and Epics, Motilal has given so many examples regarding this. But this is not the failure of ethics. It is rather the reconsideration of one value, one particular rule, particular standard of ethics. And this never rejects the basic values of ethics that need to be fostered in democracy. However, there are, when, as far as this morality, moral psychology of democracy is concerned, moral psychology means moral psychology of the people. That we, quote unquote we. What is that moral psychology of these people? How to interpret that kind of moral psychology of this we? There can be at least 3 attitudes towards this kind of democracy that we are having at this moment. The first kind of moral attitude is that, especially those who are enjoying the excess of democracy, the surplus of democracy. Some of them rather I should say, are completely non-reflective people, and some of them there are many intellectuals also belong to this group. And they actually don't bother about this kind of democracy. They want, let this continue, let this democracy continue, and everything is fine, because they are having that excess or surplus of democracy. So they don't find anything immoral, anything unethical. The practice is all right, all perfect for these people. And here I am reminded of Gramsci, that there are many people who are really educated intellectuals who are trying to guard, shield this kind of society because they are enjoying that excess surplus of democracy. They have extra rights, extra freedom and all this. And interestingly, this perception, this observation, this understanding has a Lucifer effect in society. In 2007, an interesting book was published by Philip Zimbardo. And the name of the book is The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. You will find out that to our utter surprise, the Lucifer effect is there. In the present democracy, we find this kind of transformation. People go from being moral to being immoral. They are committing evil acts. And people are becoming evil, corrupt, and brutal under the level of high peer group, the pressure of specific group, behavior and circumstances, and putting those persons into a position of authority or power over their victim. They are enjoying some kind of power, locally or some other else. So this is a kind of Lucifer effect, that being immoral is a kind of moral or kind of ethics in today's life. So from being moral, they are becoming immoral. This effect is spreads all over the society. It doesn't matter. You don't need to be moral. Morality doesn't pay anything. Secondly, there is another moral attitude towards the present anomy phenomenon that I've tried to say. Then there is also a group, a community. They believe firmly that what is going on is absolutely incorrect. It is utterly immoral. It is not acceptable at all. And this democratic society is a kind of dystopia. It is a kind of society that is not acceptable. It is a distorted, perverted democratic society. This is not actual democracy. It is the reading of those people, that group. But the point is that whenever they think like that line of thinking, they see that there is no way to deal with this. I cannot do anything, or we cannot do anything to that. And there are many subgroups, there are many layers. Some of them think that nothing can be done. Some people do not really understand that they are lacking democracy. Some people understand, yes, we lack democracy, but they come to the conclusion, all of them, there is nothing to do. Nothing can be done in this context, and their ethical view is simply my station and its duties. The Bradley once said, the British philosopher Bradley once said that my station and its duties. So I work in a university, I am a teacher, so let me do my duty in a proper way. I teach my students, I examine the scripts, and it is my duty. I am performing everything all right. It is my station and I belong to the station. What a teacher is supposed to do, I am doing, so I have nothing to do. I can't do anything for the society and what is going on, democracy, ethical, unethical. I am ethical. So it happens there. So it is that kind of ethical attitude which is my station and its duties. Thirdly, there are some critical citizens. Critical citizens, they may be intellectuals, may be academicians. For what reason we have gathered here to discuss this, the moral challenges in democracy. And some moral politicians could be there, but hardly we find that kind of politician. So they actually critically reflect on this kind of anomy phenomenon, and they try to find out certain ways. They try to find out create certain groups for mass movement or any kind of movement they think of. They are designing, they are planning. Maybe after many incidents we have seen such movements and all these things. So they are trying to do something, but ultimately nothing is changing. The conclusion is that. So on the basis of that, let me now give my own observations, my last section. Firstly, democracy is being assailed at present. If we look at the present democracy and its relation with morality, I am only trying to discuss this only from the moral perspective, nothing else. Now, democracy is being assailed in such a way, there are different mechanisms to uphold democracy like that. There is a kind of sublimated slavery in democracy, that is a kind of slavery that can be celebrated. My point is that democracy is going through a kind of politico-cultural subjection or subjugation. And it is not the traditional way of restraint on outer aspects of our life, but it is a restraint on our inner life, it is a restraint on our intellectual life, and sometimes it takes control over our body and health also. Foucault had said bioethics are not power, I'm not going to those things, it's simply understanding our inner life, intellectual life is being trapped. Do we really understand where this kind of slavery begins within democracy? It begins morally, it is alarming, it begins when we cease to feel the evil, and more important, when it deepens when the evil is accepted as a good. This is more alarming from the moral point of view, that we are tricked into accepting, we are tricked into believing that the evil is good. And again I said, there has been a happy marriage between state, capitalism, media, technology. 20-30 years back, I normally talk to my students, 25-30 years back we used to go to market in search of an object. Is there anything like that? Because I used to feel the necessity, need of that object. Now actually what is happening, the needs are manufactured. First we are acquainted with the object, then I feel that yes, this is my need. Usually what happened in the past, first we felt our need. Now what happens, we come across, we are acquainted with the objects first, then I think, okay, I need this, at any cost I need this. So this scenario has been changed. Secondly, the excess of democracy that I was talking about, if you closely observe the present society, you will find out that a new caste, a different kind of casteism you will find in present democratic society, unlike the traditional casteism in ancient India. And this new caste, as I have told, that it enjoys excess surplus of democracy, and it is more exclusive and intolerant than of the traditional castes. So unless we can break the barriers of this new caste by uplifting, by upholding a parallel foster human society, it is very difficult to get rid of this kind of problem. And there are many thinkers who have given us, there are many elements in different thinkers. Today I am not discussing about any particular thinker or philosopher. I am trying to project the problem as by the logic of facts, as you find in democratic society. So there are many thinkers, like in the philosophy of Gandhi, in the philosophy of Gramsci, in the writings of Kant, in the writings of Tagore, we can have many such elements that can help us to foster, to build up, or to form such a society that is a foster, parallel society that can respond to that particular newborn casteism or caste who is enjoying that excess democracy. K.C. Bhattacharya has also written a very, as a very good article, Swaraj in Ideas. In that article, K.C. Bhattacharya has given certain insight to this issue. Now, thirdly, what is I left there, that is the relation between plurality and totality. That is very important as far as present democracy is concerned. And here, I would like to subscribe to the view of a very contemporary thinker. She is Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt has written a very fascinating book. That is, I think the students also can go through the book. That is The Human Condition. It's a very fascinating book. Many of you know Human Condition. And two important remarks Arendt has made in that book, as far as my point is concerned today. The first point that she mentions is democracy is an engagement, that I mentioned before. And human plurality, which is actually the basic condition of our action and speech, language comes there, meaning comes there. Action and speech has that twofold character of equality and distinction. Now, if we follow the line of thinking of Hannah Arendt, we find that plurality is the condition of human action, because, as she says, we are all the same. We should follow this line. We are all the same, that is, human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives, or will live. So the present democracy, on the one hand, we know that it is always threatened by violence. The conflict has transformed into violence. And violence in any form, violence is anti-pluralistic. Because violence doesn't always mean killing or bloodshed. Violence, the initial attempt of violence, or the very first, if we try to mark violence, the characteristic of violence is to eliminate disagreement. It is the normal function, the very function of violence. Now, in this context, Arendt has nicely explained the three expressions. One is, in democracy, these three are very important as far as morality is concerned. One is otherness, the other is distinctness, and the third one is uniqueness. And this paradoxical plurality, or democracy plurality, is a paradoxical plurality in the sense that because of these three expressions that I want to, time is very short, so I need to be very brief. These three expressions, otherness, distinctness, and uniqueness, normally, when we try to define anything, any object in this world, we make distinctions. The students of philosophy are there, they very well know that when I try to define the table, I have to define it in that way that it is not chair, not table, not blackboard, not other things. So distinctions are there. We are unable to say what anything is without distinguishing it from something else. So otherness is that I share with everything is, I am, the tree is, table is, everything I share with otherness. Distinctness is what we share with the things which are actually alive. It is not just that we are other inorganic things, but we live differently. And we are different from each other in meaningful ways because we live differently. And finally, the uniqueness, which is not otherness, not the distinctness, but an expression of human ability. This is more important, democracy. An expression of ability to distinguish myself from others. So it is the distinguishing ability that is possessed by an individual. At least an individual living in a democracy is supposed to possess this kind of ability that he or she can distinguish himself or herself from others. And Arendt would say that speech and action, they actually reveal this kind of unique distinctness, speech and action. I'm not going into the action and all these things, if questions come out definitely. So, last point I would say that morality in democracy is extremely challenged because of other factor, another important factor. Theoretically, as far as this liberal democracy is concerned, theoretically we talk about a participationist model of democracy. But practically, what is followed is the consumerist model of expert governance. Democracy from this perspective is it has become a kind of dependence on the activity of the governance. Thus, democracy is understood as a procedure by which the so-called common people, I am representing the common people today, so the so-called common people would simply enjoy freedom and benefits. So freedom and benefits, they are the matter of enjoyments, and we can enjoy that in democracy. So these people are simply therefore becomes consumers and voters and never think about their participation. They have nothing to think about their participation. They know they are simply there to enjoy extra benefits, extra freedom and extra wealth and all these things. So, people of democracy, this ui, this gono in Bengali you use, have become only the recipient. And recipient has nothing to do with morality. They don't think about the basic values or moral standards. So therefore, we can take up an approach from this, which can be called a kind of democracy is a kind of way of living. And the perfectionist approach where we can go for that kind of self-purification, self-perfection. And democracy is the setting where the conscious cultivation of self-perfection against the hard morality, because what has been given to us a kind of hard morality, to use the expression of Nietzsche once used in the 19th century. That hard morality is given to us. Hard immunity is good, but hard morality is not good for democracy. So, is it possible to develop that kind of moral attitude, to change the moral attitude against this kind of hard morality that is backed by system or power or governance, whatever you say in this context? And our position is we remain critically satisfied for the statistics of the achievements of the institutional framework of democracy. So this uncritical satisfaction is very unhealthy for democracy. We go for containment, as sir was saying, containment, happiness is good, but uncritical satisfaction. One Socrates says that an unexamined life is not worth living. So our life in democratic life is, we want to enjoy individuality, freedom, rights, all things, but it is an unexamined life. And this is not that individual is doing or something like that. This life has been given to us. So we do not speak, we are actually spoken. So that kind of democracy we are having. So crisis is like that, and catharsis is that we are still living in democracy. So if we can do, because we are seeing that democracy from within fails to, all institutional framework for democracy is failing to respond to this challenge. But still, since it allows that I have said to practice morality individually, group level, forming a new kind of society, so it is up to the future what will happen. But on the one hand, this plurality need to be understood, and this is the crisis, and the same is the catharsis, because we are living in democracy after all, not in aristocracy or autocracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya, for this very insightful, I would say, presentation, submission. And I myself have been very richly rewarded for this kind of presentation, because actually from these two presentations, I myself have drawn certain clues which I believe will be extremely contributory to what I am now going to say. But before I present my viewpoint on this extremely contentious subject, I would like to put before you just two things. That is, the first speaker, this is just to help the audience to raise their questions, because the two issues, the two presentations have raised a lot of questions, and to make the question and answer session enriching, I'm just summarily, maybe that might seem a bit oversimplified, just summarily, the focal points of the two speakers. The first speaker, in a way, has made a distinction while focusing on the Phonetic tradition in ethics. A distinction between basically, I would say, two traditions or two issues. One is the kind of tradition, and so he calls it fifth ethics. There is 4 traditions in ethics which primarily have focused on issues which are largely universalist, broadly normative, somewhat Kantian. As against this phonetic tradition, it is result oriented, somewhat consequentialist, which reminds me in fact of the famous debate that took place between Amartya Sen and John Rawls, basically on this question. That is, whether it would be result oriented or it would be just normative. So this was broadly his focal point. So far as the second speaker is concerned, he has raised a lot of questions and drawn our attention to how democracy, the spirit of democracy, in fact, can be upheld, it can be safeguarded, and for that he has repeatedly drawn our attention to the necessity of engagement, not just passive citizens, but how citizens should actively participate in democracy, how the spirit of engagement can be kept alive. That is one very important point he has raised. And the other point at the end of his presentation, I think that is a kind of warning that while we talk about diversity, pluralism and all these things, and thereby he has referred to Hannah Arendt's warning, Hannah Arendt's caution that while talking about pluralism and all these things, we must guard ourselves against the danger of totality. That is, totality, it may apparently, in philosophy we use it in a Hegelian sense. In Marx also the concept of totality comes in, and that leads to the justification of collectivist ethics. All these are fine, but at the same time in practice, this notion of totality may create a lot of problems. So these are these two issues that we have since 1 p.m. we are listening to these two presentations, and thereby I think we have learned a lot. In fact, a number of a new horizon has opened up before us. I prepared my presentation in a way, but as I was listening to the two speakers, for me it has been very useful in a way. I have drawn some very interesting clues. I have got some very interesting inputs, which I think now enable me to make my presentation in a somewhat better way. Now, I am trying to look at this whole problem of democracy by keeping in mind, in fact, these things were not there in my original draft. But as I said, as I was listening to these two presentations, I thought that perhaps that famous sentence of Charles Dickens, that these are the best of times, these are the worst of times. This is very relevant for democracy today. Because right now our common sense tells us, as we look at our world, as we are gaining newer and newer experience every day, that the whole issue of democracy has in a way raised a lot of questions, questions which did not occur in our mind earlier. That way we are experimenting with democracy. So the very conceptualization of democracy is becoming richer, is becoming more and more effective. It's becoming, the discussion on democracy is becoming more and more stimulating. Questions which were very traditional, these have now become sidelined. So that way I think, yes, these are the best of times for an understanding of democracy. New horizons are opening up, new questions are coming up, new issues are being addressed. So these are, in a way, best of times for democracy. At the same time, it's also the worst of times, because democracy is being threatened. People, at times I feel that whether democracy is being hijacked or people are being hijacked. Democracy being hijacked in the name of the people, or people are being hijacked in the name of democracy. So that question, yes, that way is very disturbing. That way we are passing through a time which is extremely agonizing. So this is the agonizing time, disturbing time, and thereby worst of times. So keeping that in mind, I would just very briefly place before you my presentation in 3 parts. And I will end up again, like the 2 previous speakers. That is, I will end up in a way which is, I would say, non-conclusive. But I'm not in a position to say, well, this is the way out. So I also can just open up for you or place before you some questions. In fact, I remember that when I was first approached by the organizers of this conference, so I just told them that why are you taking up this kind of subject? It's a very complex and it's an open-ended kind of thing. So one of the organizers, so he told me that, no sir, we want a way out, because these are very disturbing. We are, every day for us, we are facing disturbing questions, disturbing issues which are agitating our mind, but we do not know the way out. And perhaps they expected that we 3 will show them the way out. But I think we are very small people. So we can at best raise more questions. Perhaps that would lead to further inquiries deepening our quest for democracy. That can, but that is our limit. I should make it very clear. Anyway, now I think the first issue is, and there I take up it was there in my mind, but I was very enriched by Professor Vardulakis' presentation. That is, if I put it like this, has democracy any intrinsic value, or democracy has just an instrumental value? If I put the question like this, that is, if we say that democracy has an intrinsic value, then in fact some of these values have been identified by Professor Bhattacharya at the beginning of his presentation. I'll just sum them up. That is, broadly speaking, what is our normal understanding as a normal human being, as a citizen in a democratic society, a citizen who has no experience of democracy, who is living under authoritarian rule. I'm not talking of that kind of citizen, but a citizen, a person, for instance, an Indian citizen, Our experience of democracy is quite different from citizens living in many other South Asian countries. So that way we are very fortunate. We are very fortunate. We have for years, for many decades, whatever be the practice of democracy, whether it is being hijacked, whether it is being subverted, whether it is being killed or not, the point is institutionally, constitutionally, officially we are still living in a democratic society. What is in store for us for future, that we don't know. But right now, till now. So if that be so, then what kind of values, what kind of morality, or if I say what would be the moral underpinnings of the kind of democracy that we expect? What would be that the values in which democracy will be anchored? So 4 or 5 at least basic things. And this I think cannot be contested, they cannot be challenged, they cannot be questioned. Every normal person who is a sane person will broadly share these things. The first thing is safeguarding the rights of the minorities. That is, democracy cannot be the rule of the majority. Officially, yes, when we vote, it is decided, that is, who will come to power, that will be decided by the majority vote. But once those who come to power, elected by majority vote, and that is the verdict of the majority, that is those who come to power now, they will have to be extremely careful and extremely responsible for safeguarding the rights of the minorities. John Stuart Mill raised this question long back, and that has to be kept in mind. This is number 1. Number 2, micro-identity. This question did not come up earlier, but nowadays, right now, this question has become very important across the world. That is, safeguarding the rights of the minorities, identifying the minorities as recognition of the rights of the micro-identities. The issue now which has become somewhat contentious in Indian context, that is identity politics. And actually identity politics now has become a problem because we did not recognize the importance of recognition of these multiple identities earlier. Long back, I am reminded of a text which is not very widely quoted, not very widely circulated, I do not know why. Amartya Sen, in fact, in the year I have in many such meetings referred to this text and asked the concerned people to read this text. That is, in the year 1998, Professor Sen delivered a lecture in Oxford as early as 1998. The name of the lecture was Reason Before Identity. A very small text, but extremely insightful. As early as 1998, Amartya Sen raised this question. In fact, there were 2 interrelated issues which he addressed in this text. One issue was that we have somehow not recognized, and thereby we have committed a major mistake in post-independence India. That is, we have not accorded recognition to the importance of the identities, multiple identities. Identities centering around, say, caste, religion, community, language, etc., gender, and all these things. But then, and that is very important issue, at the end of the lecture, he has first cited where we have committed mistakes, we have not given due recognition to these identities. That has been our blunder, all right. But at the end of the lecture, he has raised a voice of caution. Now, what is that voice of caution? The caution is that yes, we should recognize these identities, but we should also keep in mind, if I just try to summarize his word of caution, we should not valorize these identities. We should not celebrate these identities. That is, there has to be a balance between recognition and celebration. If you unduly try to celebrate these identities and thereby begin to consider them as absolute entities, then that will create a problem. So this issue is a very important aspect of democracy. And the third, I think, that issue has already been raised by Professor Bhattacharya at the very beginning of his presentation. That is tolerance. Tolerance, that is and tolerance leads to, or if I say tolerance is based on pluralism, diversity, etc. Just because I don't like your religion, just because I do not like your kind of belief, so you are for me someone who has to leave the country. No, that cannot be the style of democratic functioning. So tolerance is a very, very important issue. And the fourth issue, that issue also has been addressed by Professor Bhattacharya at the end of his lecture. Yes, that is participation. Now, participation, in political science, we quite often come across this expression, participatory democracy. But actually, that is in practice, in reality, how far this whole notion of participation is being concretely realized, that is a very, very big question. And participation, I think that also is a very, very, participation by who? If we say just participation of the masses, so this masses, this whole word, people, masses, it doesn't make apparently any sense, because it is not an undifferentiated masses. So the masses, you also have to understand it in terms of fragments. You have different groups. Nowadays you have queer groups, and all sorts of new identities which are coming up, which are emerging with their rights, with their feelings, with their emotions, with their sentiments. Earlier we just thought of gender identity, but now lots of new complex fragmented identities are they in a position to participate in their own way? So that is another moral dimension. They all have got to be respected, recognized, encouraged. So this is the first part of my discussion. Now I come to the second part. That is, if I say that this is a somewhat normative understanding of the moral dimension of democracy. That is, democracy means broadly these universalist values in which democracy should be anchored across countries, across societies. Then, and if I say that this is somewhat Kantian, this is the kind of, say, a kind of categorical imperative which should guide all democracies. Democracy should be guided by this kind of ethical, moral norms. If I say that, that's it, this is what ought to be done. The ought question. The point is, in practice, what is happening? In the name of democracy, in the functioning of democracy, what we are coming across? I think what is happening in practice, and it's not, I'm not saying that it's in practice just say over the last one decade or no time. It started long back, it has a long history. This, I would say, that this somewhat universalist Kantian understanding of democracy. Democracy means this. Democracy should be guided by this kind of categorical imperative. This is being challenged, has been challenged by a totally different kind of understanding of democracy, and that also has got a, I would say, moral underpinning. That has also got a moral justification. What is that moral justification? That many people would argue, and as I say, it is a long tradition, long intellectual tradition, long historical tradition, a long cultural tradition. What is that tradition? That all these things that you are talking about, all these sorts of prescriptive values that you are suggesting, that this is what democracy should follow. This is what democracy should try to encourage. Why? Why should we consider these as sacrosanct? Because these are things which broadly have been picked up from the West, from the European tradition, from the Western tradition, from Britain, from the United States, from Europe, broadly Europe, from Greece, from European modernity, these things. We who live in non-European countries, we who are citizens of the non-Western world, why should we subscribe to these values? We have our own tradition, which is non-Western. We were colonized, we were persecuted, and we have a long, different, indigenous kind of tradition. So we should develop our own democracy. That will be the democracy. But that is not shareable with the values prescribed by the West. And it, very interestingly, this kind of tradition, it actually developed in Europe itself. During the 30s, when the fascists came to power in Germany. In Germany, they picked up a word, it's a German word, Sonderweg. Sonderweg means special, particular road. Germany has its own path. Germany has its own tradition. Germany's tradition is not the tradition of Britain or France. So Germany has its own culture, Germany has its own tradition, somewhat authoritarian tradition. So for many of you, it may authoritarian tradition, then say a kind of tradition which is very, very much male-oriented. It may sound somewhat odd, but for Germans, it's quite normal, quite natural. We are accustomed to live under authority. For instance, in Russia also the same problem came up. And after the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, this question came up. That in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, actually what happened? Russians were accustomed to live under Tsarist autocracy. Someone who is at the top. Tsar was replaced by the party. The same thing. So democracy, the way we are accustomed to say associate democracy with certain things, they were just historically, culturally not present in many countries of Europe. The same thing happens here. In non-European countries, it is particularly relevant. Many people do not. In fact, after, say, the Second World War, when these South Asian societies began to flourish with lots of disturbances, uncertainties, one question came up, and that became quite popular in South Asian context. Asian values. We have to develop our societies, our structures of administration, our government, guided by Asian values which are different from European values. And that leads to, and that's very interesting, I will not go into that, but that opens up a new issue. There is the whole issue of post-colonialism, for example. All of you are familiar with Edward Said. When Edward Said in 1978, when he wrote this book, Orientalism, one major criticism that was leveled against Edward Said was this, that you have raised a very important question. That is the so-called Orientalism, how it ultimately creates a lot of problems by othering the non-Western countries, etc. Very stimulating, very exciting, intellectually extremely thoughtful. No doubt about that. But the difficulty is that you are actually what you are trying to argue, or the implication of what you are saying is that, number one, you are creating a binary of the East and the West, East versus West. Number one. So you are building up a Chinese wall between the East and the West. They are non-negotiable. Fine. So the West has othered the East. Now East has to other the West. They are mutually exclusive. No dialogue, no negotiation. Fine. One. Number two, that will automatically build up a case for justifying, in the name of celebration of your cultural identity and historical identity, a sort of cultural nationalism. This was in fact a kind of, I would say, accusation made by Yasser Arafat, who was a very close friend of Edward Said, because he was originally from the Arab world. So Arafat actually wrote a letter to Edward Said after this book was published in 1978, that, look, my friend, you have raised a lot of questions, very interesting questions, I fully admit. But you have also, my friend, created a problem for me. And what is that problem? You have actually tried through your, unknowingly of course, he said, I'm not saying that you have consciously done it. But you have unknowingly opened up the case of Hamas to promote their cause of Islamic fundamentalism. Because they would say, yes, our own Arab identity, that has got to be celebrated, that has got to be respected. And for that, we Hamas, we are here. We are here to celebrate the cause of Islamic fundamentalism. And Arafat said, well, how to handle it? And very interestingly, later, Said responded to this letter and said, look, you are right. I had no idea of promoting the cause of Islamic fundamentalism, Islamophobia and all these things. And years later, in an article not very widely known, the Politics of Knowledge, yes, that is the title, published in a somewhat obscure paper. There actually, Edward Said made this observation that we have to be with the same issue that was raised by Professor Amartya, that this whole issue of cultural identity in the non-Western world, that has to be very, very carefully, with great caution. These ideas have got to be addressed and discussed. Anyway, this is one problem. And this is a moral dimension. That is, for those who are in defense of, or who try to justify or rationalize this whole issue of cultural nationalism, for them it's a moral issue. Now, that actually goes against what I discussed in the first part. But this is how democracy is being defined, democracy is being viewed, democracy is being interpreted in the non-Western world. Second, another moral challenge to democracy. This question has been touched upon today in the second presentation, but I'll slightly elaborate it. That is, with the rise of neoliberalism, a new kind of morality, a new kind of moral values, a new kind of, say, moral justification of democracy has come up, which challenges morally the claims of welfarism. Welfarism, welfare state, the role of the state in promoting the welfare of the people, all these have been challenged by a new kind of morality, morality on the market. The new kind of morality. And along with it has come up another thing. There, Professor Varduloukis has addressed this question. That is, if somebody says that, look, lots of people are, say, decrying the whole idea of this neoliberal market ethics and all these things. But many people would say that neoliberalism also created jobs. It is taking away jobs. It is also creating jobs. Lots of jobs. So new opportunities are coming up. Not only that, they would say that why neoliberalism emerged? Neoliberalism emerged because of the need for addressing the issue of good governance. So consequence, effect, if neoliberalism leads to good consequences, good effect, then morally we should be guided by what Professor Varduloukis has said. Yes, process, yes. Consequence, practical wisdom. That's the important thing. So how do we get out from here? Third issue, and that is the last issue of my second part. And then I will take just a few minutes and I will close. That is number 3. This is again a moral issue, but they are not addressed as moral issues. This is a problem. That is security. Security, always, when we talk about security in the field of international relations, or say even in terms of governance, administration, etc., etc., we always consider security as a political expression, or an economic expression, or a social expression. But this is also a moral expression. It has a moral connotation. Because security, if you accept the notion of security, then why security is important? It gives me protection. Protection and care. Now, if it is said that when you are all insecure, your future is uncertain. Insecure not in terms of economic category or social category, not that kind of insecurity. You are being insecure, feeling insecure, because there is the face of the enemy, who is the other. That invisible face is threatening you. So you have to target that enemy, and find out that enemy. Now who will do this? You cannot find out your enemy. That responsibility will be shared by you. That responsibility will be taken up. By whom? By the leader. By the leader and his group. They will be in charge. You need not worry about that. I will give you protection. That is how the Duce came up in Hitler. In Italy. The Führer came up in Germany. The same kind of thing is now being addressed, but in a different way. That is, I will give you protection. I will make your country great. And if you can live under my shadow, under my umbrella, then you are fully secure. That is, it is a moral justification of my leadership in the name of security. So security that way has got a moral connotation. And if that be so, then finally, the question, as I said, Sandipan, my former student, who is one of the key organizers of this conference, Sandipan in fact told me, I asked him that why you are going for this kind of complex issue some of the issues might go over the heads of the audience. He said, no, sir, please come and raise some questions. What is our way out? No, I'm not giving any roadmap for way out. No, I do not have that capacity, and I will not venture to go into this. But I will simply address some of the probable, and I emphasize the word probable, some of the probable issues which perhaps, again very tentative, perhaps probable, may be considered if you believe that they are important. The first thing is that a dialogue is needed between these two schools. One school which considers democracy as a universal concept, has certain universal categories, whether it is Western or not, but they have all been picked up from the West. So this is one. And the other is that those of us who believe that, well, the non-Western world will have to be guided by its own understanding of democracy. They are not poles apart. This binary should be broken. East has to learn a lot from the West. West has to learn a lot from the East. Because ultimately, I think what is most important is the cause of democracy itself. Then that democracy, it has to be a mix-up of these two things. I am reminded of a book. In fact, Professor Bardulakis, I think, is a better person to comment on this book. Long back in the 70s, a book, a 3-volume work came out. And that later raised a lot of controversy also. Martin Bernal, The Black Athena. That book actually, he raised this question. That is how the West, particularly ancient Greece, it is indebted to the West. Very recently, a book has come out, and that has also raised a lot of. But these books are coming out. This book was written long back, but very recently a book came out. I think the title is something like that, African Mathematics or Mathematics in Africa, something like that. I'm just forgotten. Now that book is very interesting. It was written by a team of scholars, mainly from say western part of Europe. I think some were Dutch, some were French. That is not the important. The issue is, in that book it has been claimed that mathematics, modern mathematics, originated actually in Africa. Now, and a number of evidences have been shown. That is not the point. The interesting point is this, that not only mathematics originated from Africa, but we have to consider Africa as the only and exclusive father of mathematics. And that has created a lot of controversy. This is the problem. That is, if you begin in the name of saying that yes, East also has its own treasure, East also has its own tradition, fine, you respect it. But in the name of celebration of this, that is this nativist culture, nativist tradition, if you now exclude the West, just as the West has excluded the East, then the problem is that you stop the road of negotiation. So that way, this is very, very important. This binary has to be broken. And second, this is a more complex question. Again, this can be at best a prescriptive statement, nothing beyond that. That is, this issue was addressed by Professor Bhattacharya, totality. Yes, that is a big problem. I am reminded of Georg Lukács, Theodore Adorno made a very strong critique of Lukács's understanding of totality in his very famous work, History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923, subsequently banned for political reasons. That is not the issue. But Adorno made an uncompromising critique of Lukács, and he was strongly against totality, because he had his own experience of, and as many of you know, that Adorno said that ultimately European modernity is a very, I would say, very pathetic and desperate statement. That European modernity, what is its meaning? Modernity means, actually, it leads to gas chamber. That is modernity. But this same Lukács, in his last writings, when he was just fighting cancer, he wrote actually one manuscript was left unfinished, the process of the democratization. And another work, 3-volume work, fully not translated in English, ontology. There's ontology, the last one, the ontology, the Marx. He pointed out that and that is where Lukács actually comes out with his understanding of democracy. What is that? That is self-emancipation of labor, the ontology of social labor. That is, we have to celebrate only one thing, and that is how you can ensure your participation in a meaningful way. That is emancipation of my labor. Those who do not labor, they cannot really participate. They cannot be considered as participants in the democratic process. And thirdly, and with that I stop, that is, some people argue, in fact, in today's presentation at the beginning, Sandeepan referred to Partho Chatterjee's focus on this spontaneity of the subaltern groups, etc., who can perhaps build up a kind of, say, firewall against the kind of threats to democracy. But here also I have a problem. That is, suppose if someone believes, and many people are talking about that if we have to fight the way democracy is being subverted across the world. A question has already been raised by Professor Bhattacharya in his address, that people, are we really participating? Or are we just a manipulated mass? But that would be also an oversimplified statement. All of us are not being manipulated. We who are participating in this conference, we are not manipulated. We are very much aware of this problem. We are extremely alarmed about this problem of how people are being manipulated. So, people, masses, this is not undifferentiated entities. Therefore, the problem is, if you just give vent to the forces of spontaneity, that will necessarily, that is, unfolding of the spontaneity of the masses, that will necessarily lead to promotion of democracy. Well, I think nobody can guarantee. This is what happened in Arab Spring, when Arab Spring happened. But what happened ultimately after Arab Spring? Occupy Wall Street movement. That was also a very, I would say, vibrant expression of democracy. But what happened about that? If you have to really launch a kind of counter-subversion, as democracy is being subverted by those who are, say, ruling in the name of democracy, if that counter-subversion has to be launched, then I think you require two more things. But our historical practices so far have revealed that these things also did not work. One is, you require an organization, you require an ideology. Unfortunately, the world was ruled by an alternative ideology through an organization, but the whole thing collapsed in 1991. But just because the system collapsed, that does not mean the importance of organization and ideology for launching the case of counter-subversion, that has become unimportant. You have to rethink the way this organization and ideology, this can be readdressed, this can be renewed, this can be recharged. Thank you.
Words fail me to thank the speakers today and the moderation. Sorry. We can go ahead with the last part of this. A formal vote of thanks by the head of the Department of Philosophy, Dr. Shuntu Kandar, after which we can continue with this over coffee, and that would be deemed the question answer session. Thank you for bearing with us. Food is waiting outside just after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all of you. It's an honor and privilege to give the vote of thanks on this significant occasion jointly organized by Department of Philosophy and Political Science of Ramakrishna Mission Vidyamandir. First of all, we are grateful to Swami Mahapragyananda, our revered Principal Maharaj, for his brief welcome address despite his busy schedule. And our sincere gratitude goes to our distinguished speakers, Professor Dimitris Vardoulakis and Professor Pralayankar Bhattacharya, for their illuminating and thought-provoking lectures. We deeply appreciate your efforts and profound contributions. A special thanks to Professor Shomanlal Dattagupta for expertly chairing the technical session and for his invaluable reflection, which added depth to the discussion. We are also grateful to all the participants for their keen interest, active engagement, and valuable participations, which made the symposium truly interactive and meaningful. Lastly, our heartfelt appreciation to the organizing committee, especially Professor Swarup Roy and Indrasis Banerjee and other professors from both the Department of Philosophy and Political Science. Volunteers and support staff whose tireless effort ensured the seamless execution of today's event. Thank you all again. Have a nice day.